Good morning,
Good morning.
and good morning to those who are watching online as well. If you have a Bible, turn to Hebrews chapter 11. Last Sunday, I looked at Hebrews 10 and 11, ended in verse 6 or so of Hebrews 11. We looked at what faith is like. We talked about faith, how to define faith, what it looks like, definitions. This morning, I want to continue on in the book of Hebrews, and I don't know, just the topic of faith is a very large topic. So I'm not going to look at near everything about faith, but I thought this morning I would look at three people that are listed in Hebrews 11 as men of faith. And I titled the message, Faith in Action. What does faith look like lived out? We talked about faith, like defining faith last Sunday. This morning I'm going to look at three people and different aspects of their life and what faith looks like in their life. My main text is going to be from verses 7 to about 29. I'm not going to read every verse, and I'm not going to read it all at one time, but I will look at one person at a time, the passage or the verses in Hebrews 11 that talk about them, and then we'll look in Genesis where it talks about them as well. The first one is Noah. Noah had the faith to obey. So we're going to look at three aspects of what faith looks like in action. Noah had the faith to obey. We're going to look at Abraham. He had the faith to follow God. And then we're going to look at Moses. Moses had the faith to suffer with the people of God. So the faith to obey, the faith to follow, and the faith to suffer. Hebrews 11, verse 7. By faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. Noah had the faith to obey God when it was not popular to obey God. And to get a glimpse of that less than popular mindset, we need to go back to Genesis 5. So keep your finger here in Hebrews 11, but go back to Genesis 6. Sorry, not Genesis 5. Genesis 6, verses 5 to 8. I have the verses here on the board as well, but we'll come back to Hebrews 11 in a bit. But I thought just to get a little bit of a picture of the atmosphere around Noah, we need to look a little at the passage in Genesis 6. Genesis 6, verses 5 to 8. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Other passages said that Noah was a just man. He was alone in his generation. Everyone else around him was wicked, and the description of the people around him was that they were very wicked, and the thoughts of their heart was only evil continually. I don't know what it would have been like to be Noah. I think it's bad enough in our society, but we have people like this where we gather together and we have the same focus and the same love for God. We have people in other churches around us that love God, and their focus is, their desire is to serve God. Noah was alone, and yet he had the faith to obey God. When God said, do something that is so ridiculous, everyone's going to call you crazy, they're going to call you a lunatic, they're going to laugh at you, they're going to make fun of you. Here's what I want you to do, Noah. It's going to rain. That alone was something that had never happened before. It hadn't rained before. And then God says, okay, so it's going to rain. And then imagine Noah telling the people, yeah, like water's going to start falling from the sky. It's going to rain. They'd be like, no, you're crazy. We don't know what you're talking about. There's a dew that comes up from the ground. There's a mist that covers the ground. That's how the water covers. That's how the plants get their water, not falling from the sky. And then Noah says, oh yeah, by the way, he's talking, I'm imagining him talking to the people. Oh yeah, by the way, this God that I serve that you don't know anything about, but the God that I've been telling you about, he told me that it's going to rain and he's going to destroy everyone with the flood. But I'm supposed to build this big ark. We're not talking a little boat here. We're talking a really, 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 really big boat. Over 400 feet long, approximately 450 feet long. This is the size of some of the cruise ships that come into the harbor over on the west side on the Hudson River. I'm supposed to build this ark, Noah says, and you can come with me into the ark and you're going to be saved. In addition to the how crazy that might have sounded, Noah's like, I'm going to build the ark up on the land. I'm not going to build it down next to the sea where we can maybe somehow roll it into the water. I'm going to build it up here on the land. I don't know how far he lived from the sea, but it wasn't, by appearances, it wasn't right next to the sea. It's a testimony of Noah's faith to obey God, to actually do that. Noah had the faith to obey God even when everyone else around him was not obeying God. Like, that alone is pretty significant faith, to be the only person that actually followed God. Second, the faith to obey God and do something that seemed totally absurd. That's about as crazy as you can get. And then on top of that, Jude said that he was a preacher, it's in 2 Peter, said that he was a preacher of righteousness. So as he's building this ark, I imagine, and this is only speculation, but I imagine people coming out to laugh at Noah. Like, Noah, what are you going to do today? When's it going to start raining? Like, you've been talking about this for 50 years. Don't you think it's about time for the rain to come? Like, your boat's kind of taking shape, but it's not going to float. Like, even if it does get completed, how's it going to float? Like, you're not close to the water. Noah had the faith to obey God even when it seemed crazy. What motivated that faith? Back in Hebrews 11, verse 7, it tells us that he was moved with godly fear. That godly fear of God caused him to obey. That the term that's used there, godly fear, it includes a reverence for God. It includes just taking God at his word and actually following and doing what God says, like walking in obedience to what he says. I would say that Noah didn't fear losing his life. He feared disobeying God. He didn't want to disobey the God that he served. That was a greater fear, I believe, to Noah than the fear of maybe I'll die in the flood if I don't do this. I think that Noah had this godly fear, this reverence of God, and that caused him to obey. Notice also what it says at the end of this verse here in verse 7. This is Hebrews 11, verse 7. Through his faith, he condemned the world, and he became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. I mentioned earlier, 2 Peter describes Noah as a preacher of righteousness, and we don't know exactly what that looked like. Was Noah preaching every day as he's building the ark? Or was it simply his life, his walking in obedience to God that condemned the world? Or was it both? I tend to think it was both. Noah's obedience to God highlighted the people around him's disobedience. Just by them seeing Noah following God, that highlighted their lack of obedience to this God that Noah served. Noah's faith in God showed their lack of faith. Noah's commitment to God showed their commitment to sin and to pleasure. The ungodly person is not only condemned by the preaching of our words, but they are also condemned through a godly life that is lived out. Noah, through his obedience, through his faith, he condemned the world. William Barclay notes, going back into history in Athens, he says, one of the finest men who ever lived in Athens was Aristides, who was called the Just One. But the other people of Athens voted to banish and to ostracize him. One man, when he was asked, why are you banishing Aristides? And legend has it that this man actually talked to Aristides and didn't realize who he was talking to, but he said that he was voting against him to banish him. And Aristides like, so why, what do you have against him? He's like, well, I don't know anything about him. I've never met him, but I cannot stand the fact that he's called the just one. His life alone caused other people to dislike him. His life alone brought condemnation to those around him. Barclay says, there is danger in goodness, for in the light of goodness, evil stands condemned. I think it's important to note that for Noah, this reference to him condemning the world, I think is largely in the difference in the way that he lived his life, and that life alone was bringing condemnation to the world. I believe that he also preached about God and tried to encourage people to join him in serving God. Some questions for us. Through obedience, actually, I think I have a few things mixed up here. I had a question. This is the questions I wanted. Is your faith in God condemning the world? And what I mean by this question, I'm not asking, are you walking around saying you're going to hell and you should change your ways? I'm asking, are you living a godly life so that when other people look at you, they are convicted of the sin in their own life simply by the way that you are faithfully living out your relationship with God? Are you living a godly life to the extent that others feel convicted when they're around you? An example of this, soon after we were married, I was the place where I was working. I don't know that any of the other of my coworkers were professing Christians. And one of my coworkers, he used lots of bad language. But it was interesting, whenever he was around me, like he would say a swear word. It's like, oh, I'm sorry, like I shouldn't have said that. My presence, because I didn't use that language, my presence brought conviction to him. I wish I would have done more in actually sharing my faith and actively encouraging him to change his life as well. I did some. But my life was bringing condemnation to him. He recognized that what he was doing was wrong without me even saying anything, simply because I was living a different life. So is your life condemning the world? Is your commitment or your faith in God making others feel convicted for not living that way? As you think of Noah walking in obedience to God, are there areas in your life that maybe you need faith to obey God? Maybe the faith to walk in obedience to God's word when people around you aren't doing that, or the faith to obey God and believe that he really means what he says. Simple obedience is not legalism. Simple obedience is simply what it means to follow Jesus. If you have a genuine faith, you will be like Noah and you will walk in obedience. I'm not saying we're perfect. I have a lot of areas, a lot of growth that I need to do in my own life. I pray that we could have the same kind of faith that Noah had, that because of his faith in God, it motivated him to obey. Noah had faith to obey when it wasn't popular, and through his faith and obedience, he was declared righteous. The end of verse 7 says that he became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. His faith was counted to him for righteousness. That's actually a quote referencing Abraham, but the same is true about Noah. Noah had the faith to obey. The second example I want to look at is Abraham. Abraham had the faith to follow. He also, it mentions that he obeyed God, but I want to think about him following God. And you can't really separate faith in God with action resulting out of that faith. So whether it's walking in obedience or obedience and following, in verses 8 to 12, I here back in Hebrews 11, verse 8, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he dwelt in the land of promises in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Abraham had the faith to follow God, not knowing where he was going. And to get a picture of this, or to get, again, the fuller picture, let's go back to Genesis 12, when God speaks to Abraham initially. Genesis 12, I'm going to look at verse 1, and verses 2 and 3 are God's promises to Abraham, and then verses 4 to 7 are Abraham's response. But verse 1 is the instruction that God gives to Abraham. This is Genesis 12, verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you." And then verses 2 and 3, God promises blessing on him if he does that. Verse 4, so Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abraham was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. He took Sarah his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh, and there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Abraham had the faith to follow God, even though he didn't know where he was going. Leaving everything that's familiar, he left his country, he left his community, he left his friends, he left his father's house. Everything that was familiar to him, he left to follow God. He had the faith to do that. Why did he have the faith to do that? Or how did he have that faith? Not because he knew where he was going, because he didn't know yet. God says, "You leave, I'll show you where to go." His faith was in the God that he served, and that faith motivated him to follow. Back in Hebrews 11, especially in verse 10, I think it gives us a clue as to why Abraham did this. It says that he looked for a heavenly city, one that God himself was building. Abraham wasn't looking just for land here on the earth. Abraham knew that his ultimate destination was not here. Ultimately, he wanted to be with God. He was looking for a heavenly city, a city that had foundations, a city where God was, where he would be with God. Last week, I gave you the quote, faith is trust in the unseen. It's not trust in the unknown. For we can know by faith what we cannot see with the eye. Abraham knew God. So it wasn't, his faith was not in the unknown. He knew God, and he knew that God was asking him to go. But his faith was trust in the unseen. He couldn't see where he was going yet, but he had the faith to see that. He had the faith to look ahead to the city that God was going to make for him. But more importantly than the city, Abraham had faith in God. Abraham knew God. And even though he couldn't see God, he had faith in God. Even though he didn't know how everything would look, Abraham knew who he was serving. And because of that faith in God, he had faith to move ahead with what he couldn't see. He knew, but he couldn't see. So faith is not what we don't know. We do know God. Faith is trust in the unseen. We cannot see yet. Abraham was looking for the ultimate promised land, heaven. Canaan was the immediate promised land. God had promised this land to Abraham and to his descendants. But Abraham, I think, was looking even beyond that to heaven. He was looking for that heavenly city that God was building. In addition to the faith to follow, it's noted in Hebrews 11, verses 17 to 19, Abraham also had the faith to obey, just like Noah did. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, he offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, "In Isaac your seed shall be called," concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he had also received him in a figurative sense. The faith that Abraham had in God motivated him to obey God. God says, "Leave your land, go to a place that I'll show you." And Abraham's like, "Okay, I'll follow you. You're leading the way. I'll follow you there." After he's there, later, God promises a son, and Abraham is figuratively dead. He's too old to have a son. His wife's too old to have a child, but God does a miracle and gives them Isaac. And then God says, "I want you to offer up Isaac. I want you to give me back the son that I gave to you." And Abraham is like, he didn't say it flippantly. I know he didn't, but I picture Abraham saying, "Okay, Figuratively, I was dead when you gave him to me. Like, we shouldn't have been able to have this son. So if I do give this son back to you, you'll raise him up from the dead. You'll do something. Abraham knew who he was serving, and that's what motivated him to obey. He was confident in the God that had told him to do this. And so that gave him the confidence to follow. It gave him the confidence to obey. Do I have that kind of faith? Are we grounded in our faith in God? Do we know who we're serving? That's the kind of faith I want to have. Do we have the kind of faith that Abraham had that caused him to leave everything he knew as normal and follow God into the unknown or the unseen? But because he knew God, he was willing to follow. Another thing that's key, and I'll look at this at the end, Abraham, Noah, Moses, all of these, they recognized that they were strangers and pilgrims here. Do we recognize that we are strangers and pilgrims here in this life? Do we long like they did? Do we long for this heavenly city, our permanent home where God will be with us? That's the kind of faith that God wants us to have. That's the kind of faith I want to have, where I look forward to that heavenly city and I long for that. It's easy for me to get distracted and think that this life here is, and I know I don't think this life here is the end, but it's easy for me to start living that way. I want us to recognize that we are strangers and pilgrims here, and that when difficulties come, it should make us long all the more for heaven. The third person I'm going to look at is Moses. Moses had the faith to suffer. Hebrews 11, verses 24 to 29. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith, he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. Note the phrase that keeps showing up here at least 4 times, by faith. We see it in verses 24, 27, 28, and 29. By faith, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. By faith, he forsook Egypt and everything that it had to offer him. By faith, he kept the Passover, believing that God would somehow accept that sacrifice and protect their firstborn. You could also add in here, by faith, he led his people out of Egypt. And it says, by faith, he went through the Red Sea, believing the waters would stay back so that they could pass through. I think verse 25 is a key verse here. And this is what I want to focus on, Moses' faith. Moses had the faith to suffer affliction with the people of God rather than to enjoy the temporary pleasures of sin. He recognized that Egypt wasn't their final destination. I'm guessing that Moses was told by his mom or by his parents or by the others about God's promise to Abraham years and years and years before this. And Moses is thinking, I'm growing up in Pharaoh's palace. I've been adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. I could have all the riches. I could have all the wealth. Everything that Egypt had to offer was available to him. But he recognized that this is not where I really belong. This isn't my eternal home. I'm looking forward to something greater. God's promise for our people is not in Egypt. God's promised land is back in Canaan. And he chose to suffer with God's people rather than live in the palace of the king and enjoy the pleasures of sin. Because pleasures last only for a season, but the consequences of sin last for eternity. And I think Moses had that understanding of that mentality. The pleasures of sin last for a season, and it is pleasurable for a season, but the consequences of sin last for eternity. And Moses wasn't willing to go there. He said, I would rather choose to suffer with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, because he was able to see beyond the present to see the eternal. He was able to have an eternal perspective. And if we want to have the faith in God that Noah and Moses and Abraham had, we need to be able to see past the present and look to the future like they did. Moses believed God's promise to Abraham that Egypt wasn't their promised land. I don't know if I said that correctly. Moses believed that God promised to Abraham that he gave back in Genesis 12, and he promised him this land. Egypt wasn't the fulfillment of that. Canaan was that fulfillment. And Moses is like, we need to pack up and leave. At this point, the children of Israel had been in Egypt for about 390 years. For us today, you go back 390 years, you're 1633. That's 7 years after Manhattan was purchased from the local people for $24. At least according to legend, that's how much it was purchased for. In 1630, so about that same time, like 390 years ago, there were approximately 300 European settlers in this whole region from here, 140 miles north, the whole region of New York, as was known then. That gives you an idea how far back 390 years is. The children of Israel had been in Egypt for about 390 years when Moses shows up on the scene. He's banished into the wilderness. Now she's banished. He runs away for 40 years and he comes back and leads them out. And scripture tells us that they were in Egypt 430 years and then they left. Moses had the faith to see beyond the present. He had the faith to have an eternal perspective. He had the faith to see that what is today doesn't have to always be. I find this challenging and ask the question, do I have that kind of faith? The kind of faith that helps me see beyond the present to where I'm willing to suffer now in order to follow God so I'm not eternally separated from God. Moses was willing to follow God even if it meant suffering, and countless others throughout the centuries have done the same thing. Are we willing to suffer in order to follow Jesus? How did these men go against the tide of their time? What made their faith different? I think verses 13 to 16 in Hebrews tell us. They all died in faith, not having received the promises. That's why it was faith. But they saw them afar off, and they were assured of them. They embraced them, and they confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had been called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. I think verse 13 should be key for us. They died in faith. They embraced the promises. They confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Because of that faith, because of that realization that this world is not their eternal home, they embraced the hardships that came with following God. They were willing to be ridiculed for their faith in God. They obeyed even when it seemed ridiculous. They followed God even when they couldn't see where they were going because they knew the God they were serving. This wasn't a blind faith. They knew the God that they served. They just didn't know where they were going. They couldn't see that yet, but they had faith in their God because they knew him. They were willing to suffer because they were strangers and pilgrims here. They embraced death joyfully because they knew this world was not their final home. Their faith was a visionary faith. They saw these promises afar off. They could get a glimpse of them. They could see them through eyes of faith, even though they couldn't physically see them. But because they knew the God that they served, they kept these promises alive in their hearts and minds through faith. It was a visionary faith. It was also a growing faith. As they walked with God, their faith continued to grow. They saw how God worked in the past, and that gave them courage to keep moving forward. Their faith was also a working faith. It resulted in obedience. It couldn't lie dormant. It had to be lived out. I gave you the quote, I think it was last week, from Menno Simons. True evangelical faith cannot lie dormant. It clothes the naked. It feeds the hungry. I can't quote it exactly. True faith cannot lie dormant. Their faith was a working faith, a living faith, and it was also an enduring faith. They didn't give up. They kept looking ahead, and they died in faith. They hadn't received the promises. They were still willing to follow God, and they died joyfully. And I think finally they were also rewarded for their faith. The end of verse 13. No, not the end of verse 13. The end of verse 16. It says that God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Can we live like Noah and Abraham and Moses and countless other believers through history? Can we have the same kind of visionary faith, a faith that says, you know what, I'm not staying here. I'm willing to endure suffering here. I'm willing to endure hardship here because I'm following God to something far greater. Will our faith continue to grow? A faith that says, God, I trust you. I've seen you working in the past. And I'm more convinced now than ever that you are the only way, and I'm going to follow you no matter what. Well, we have a working faith that continues on. That says, God, I'm going to follow you. I'll serve you. I'll obey you in everything. Well, we have an enduring faith, one that does not give up when things get difficult. True faith in action will live that way. True faith recognizes that we are strangers and pilgrims. True faith will obey like Noah did, like Abraham did. True faith will follow wherever God asks us to go, like Abraham did and others. And true faith will suffer as Moses did, because we know that we have somewhere better to go, where God is preparing a city for us, and we too will be rewarded for our faith. Let's pray. God, thank you for examples in Scripture. We only looked at a few, but thank you for multitudes of others who have gone before us, who have shown us examples of how to live the Christian life. We can follow their example, but more importantly, we follow you because we know that you are trustworthy. And we take courage from others who have shown by their example how they followed you. Help us to keep our eyes fixed on you, though, not to keep our eyes fixed on those around us, but to keep looking to you, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, he ran the race, he gave his life so that we could be forgiven, so that we could be part of your family. Help us to have this faith in action, to have a vibrant, living faith. And I pray that through our lives, others around us will see the difference that we have, the difference that you have made in our life, and that it will bring condemnation to themselves or bring conviction to them, that they would be able to see and want what we have. Help us to follow you in all things, even when we don't understand. Give us the courage to keep on going. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.